was thinking about one of my favorite books as a kid. It was a book that came out when I was probably in like the 7th or 8th grade. It's a book maybe some of you read called Holes. And in the book Holes, it was kind of, it was a two-part story. It was about a young man. His name was Stanley Yelnats, and he was falsely accused of stealing a pair of shoes, and so he was sent to a work camp for boys to go and kind of work off his debt to society and learn how to work hard. And at the same time that there was this story running, there was another story running parallel to it that the book told, and it was about an outlaw named Kissin' Kate Barlow who hid her treasure out in this salt flat. And these two stories ran parallel to each other. And you knew they were going to come together, and you knew that they were working together and that they were telling, in some ways, the same story, just from a different perspective. And finally they come together, and it was a book that I really loved whenever I was younger. But at the same time, that's kind of one of the marks of a lot of great stories. Maybe you've read a story like that, and there's multiple storylines going on, and you know that they're going to merge. You know that they're kind of telling the same story from different perspectives. You just don't always see how. And today, as we go into Mark chapter 14, we're going to be in verse number 26, going through verse number 50. And as we do, we're going to see those two stories running parallel, side by side. One of them is the story of the disciples, the story of Peter and of his relationship with Jesus. And the other is going to be the story of Jesus himself and his interactions. And we're going to see that the two have very different experiences, even though they're going to the same places and they are kind of experiencing in some ways the same thing, but the way that they experience them is very different. And here this week we're going to see Jesus' experience in the garden, a painful experience, one that Larson led us in worship with this morning. Not my will, but your will be done. We're going to see those amazing words of Christ. But at the same time, it's running parallel to the story of the disciples who keep falling asleep. The disciples who Jesus says, would you watch and pray? Jesus, while he's in anguish and while he's hurting, he says, would you stand beside me? And the disciples not really thinking, not really understanding the gravity of the situation. And so we see these two stories running parallel, the story of Jesus and really the story of Peter that we'll also see continued into next week. And their different experiences that they have. And I think both of these stories, while they have some different things to teach us, they also are leading up to that one ultimate truth. So would you read with me here, starting in Mark chapter 14, verse number 26. And we're just going to start in verse 26 and work through it piece by piece. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, you will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. So as we stop there for just a second, again, I just love that picture, and I can't say it enough, of Jesus singing. We get a lot of pictures of God in Scripture, and I think one of the reasons I love this is because, again, books that I've read whenever I was younger, the Chronicles of Narnia. If you ever read the Chronicles of Narnia, you see one of the pictures of Aslan, who is the lion who's supposed to represent Jesus, is he sings all things into creation. As he's creating Narnia, he's singing, and from his voice, these things pop up. Anyways, I just love that picture. And again, I don't have any super deep theological thing to plug in there other than that's just a great picture of Jesus. And sometimes we don't have to have something deeply theological about every single thing in Scripture. Sometimes we can look at that and just say, that's beautiful. That picture itself of Jesus singing with his disciples is a beautiful picture. And then they went out to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is an interesting place. It's often talked about in Scripture, and there's a lot of significance there. In fact, if you were to go to the Mount of Olives today, you would actually find olive trees that have been there for thousands of years. Olive trees that were very likely there whenever Jesus himself was walking on the Mount of Olives. And the reason that I mention this specifically is because we're going to see the scene of much of today's interaction in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that garden is at the foot of the Mount of Olives, and literally Gethsemane means to press, or to be pressed. It's this idea of pressing the olives. It was a place where they would grow the olives, and then they would be pressed into oils and those different kind of things. But I think that's an interesting picture that we see of being pressed Because today we're going to see that that metaphor also applies to what's happening to Jesus in the garden and what's happening to his disciples as they seek to follow him, as they seek to walk by him. There's this pressing that's happening. And whenever Jesus is pressed, we see out of him come these beautiful words, "Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." We see something a little bit different come out when the disciples are pressed. But as we continue, Jesus says to them, "You will all fall away. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Now, if you're like me and you're just reading through this seems almost a little bit out of place, right? Like they're walking up to the Mount of Olives. They're going to this garden to pray. And as he's walking, they've just sung this hymn. They've just had this really great meal, right? The disciples are probably feeling pretty good. And he says, "Hey guys, by the way, all of you are going to leave me alone." Like, what would you feel if you were the disciples in that moment? Like, hold up, Jesus. You're saying we're all going to fall away? That we're all going to leave you? That we're going to be betraying you? You told us earlier in the supper that somebody was going to betray you, and all of us were like, "Well, it can't be me, Lord, right? Not me. Not me." And now you're telling us this again, that we're all going to fall away? Like, no, never. And the disciples are kind of indignant about this, and we're going to read this, but I think it's important that we see what Jesus quotes here. Jesus quotes a verse. He says, "You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." And then Jesus says, "But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Here, the verse specifically that Jesus is quoting comes from the prophet Zechariah, chapter number 13, verse number 7. We read this, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones." Here Jesus quotes this verse saying, "You're all going to leave me. You're all going to scatter away from me." But he doesn't say you're all going to scatter away from me because of the awesome power of the Roman government. He doesn't say you're all going to scatter away from me because you're really scared of the priests and the scribes and all of those people who would come after you. Jesus recognizes something, that they're scattering, that his isolation that would be caused in this time was not the work of some external forces, but was instead the divine providence of God. And I think that's what allowed him in this moment to have the peace and to have the tranquility that he had even as he prays. And I love this, that whenever we see him in the garden here in just the next few verses, he goes to God specifically because he knows that God is the source of this thing that's about to happen. This event in history that has been ordained by him, this thing that is going to come about, and it must be done in order that our salvation will be bought. And so Jesus is going to go to God during this time, but he tells his disciples emphatically, he doesn't say, most of you will fall away. Some of you will probably fall away. All of you will likely think about falling away, and most of you might, maybe, possibly, probably fall away. But Jesus knew, because it had been ordained by God, that all of his disciples would fall away. He knew that they would. But I love this verse number 28. Because even in that certainty that Jesus speaks, when he says, you will all fall away. You will all leave me alone. I will suffer the worst day in all of history by myself. But then in verse number 28, I think you just see a picture of just the beauty of the grace of Christ. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. See, this is actually a really special little piece of verse, because we know that whenever Jesus first raises up, where does he first see his disciples? He sees them in Jerusalem, right? And if Jesus was just trying to make a statement that would be really impressive to all Jewish people, he would have specifically mentioned Jerusalem. That was the most significant location in all of Israel. If he was going to talk about coming back someplace and seeing them someplace, if he was trying to make the point, as he has many, many times, that he is the Messiah, that he is the Son of God, that he is the one who would die and be raised again in Jerusalem in fulfilling of the prophecies, then he would have said, and I will go before you and I will see you again here in Jerusalem. But that's not what he says. He says, when I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. This is something that's speaking specifically to his disciples. Remember where Jesus first met his disciples? It was in Galilee. Where are most of his disciples from? Where would they call home? Where did they feel comfortable? It was in Galilee. The majority of his people had come there in the same province that Jesus had, from Galilee. And Jesus now comforting them, saying, yes, you will all fall away. Yes, you will all leave me. Yes, you will all utterly abandon me, but I'll be waiting for you at home. Isn't that beautiful? That Jesus doesn't say, and so you're all a bunch of sorry suckers and you just need to get out. Like, why are you even here with me? Why are you even coming to the garden with me? I know you're going to betray me anyways. Why don't you just go ahead and leave? No. Jesus says, you're going to betray me. But even after that, when I'm raised up, I'll go before you and I'll be waiting for you at home. I just think that's a beautiful picture of Jesus' grace, even this in the time where he is knowing that he is going to be sorely pressed, knowing that he is about to walk to the cross. And if any time in all of existence and all of human history we could forgive somebody for being a little bit selfish, you would think it would be Jesus on his way to the cross, right? Like, hey, Jesus, you're about to become sin, though you have never known sin. You are about to take on all of the sins of the world. Perfection is about to be taken on by this horrible, horrible weight of humanity and sin. If there's any time that we could have said, like, yeah, Jesus, this could have been the time that you asserted your own will. This could have been the time that you're like, man, guys, really after 3+ years of following me, you're all going to leave me alone? Man, you're really sorry excuses for disciples. If there's one time that we could have forgiven Jesus for exerting his own will, forgive anybody for exerting their own will, it would have been here. But even here, Jesus, the perfect Son of God, says, yes, you will betray me. Yes, you will leave me. But I'll be waiting for you. I'm going to be waiting for you at the place where you feel comfortable, at the place where we first met, at the place where you first saw me and followed me. I will raise up and I will be waiting for you in Galilee. And so now as we continue through here, we see in verse number 29, Peter does the most Peter thing that Peter has ever done. And he says, even though they all fall away, I will not. Isn't that just the most Petery thing you've ever heard? I mean, we love Peter, right? For the same reasons that Peter is so frustrating, Peter is so awesome, because sometimes we're the same way. Like, we're those rash people like, no, I mean, everybody else might do that, but not me, Lord. I mean, it's kind of like low-key insulting his friends who were there with him, right? Like, yeah, I could see James and John, like, they might totally abandon you, Jesus, but not me. I'm your guy. I gotcha, right? I just think that's so funny, and it's so human, and again, so relatable for us, right? Because sometimes we're like that too, right? Sometimes, yeah, other people might struggle with that, Jesus. Other people might have those secrets, that other people might fall into temptation, but not me. No, Jesus, not me. But then in verse number 30, we read this, and Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Again, I just love this because Jesus doesn't say like, shut up, Peter. Peter, stop being so Petery. But he just tells him, like, this is the fact. You're going to deny me. You're going to deny me 3 times. Even before the sun comes up this night, you will deny me 3 times. And again, one of the things that we can never truly understand about Jesus, though he was fully human, is since he was fully God, he understood the weight of his position far greater than any of us can, right? Like in the same way that we go through difficult things sometimes and we don't understand what's coming next, Jesus had full knowledge of what was about to come. He knew the suffering that he would endure. He knew the torture that was to come. He knew the mocking and the rejection and the betrayal. He knew all of it, and yet he continued to march towards the cross. It's a mercy often that we don't know what is up ahead, because oftentimes that might dissuade us from doing what we need to do, right? If we had the same knowledge that Jesus had, we'd be like, oh, that's coming? Yeah, left turn, right? I want to go over here, Jesus. I don't think I want to go and do that. But Jesus, having the full knowledge of what was ahead, still marched on step by step, and even telling Peter again, this is going to happen. You're going to deny me. But even in that, still walking with Peter to the garden. Still letting Peter be intimate in that relationship with him. Peter and James and John, though they would betray him, though they would run away from him, though they would fall away, he still allowed them to come in his moment of anguish. He allowed them to be with him. And we read this in verse number 31. But he, that's Peter, said emphatically, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said the same. I think this gives us a good picture into the tyranny of sin in our lives. You see, the thing with Peter that we're about to see here is Peter said, "No, I would never do something so heinous as to deny you." But we're about to see here in the life of Peter a couple of things. Jesus is going to say, "Watch and pray." 3 separate times. Watch with me for 1 hour. Peter's going to fall asleep. He's going to come back and he's going to specifically say, though all the disciples were asleep, Jesus is going to say to him, "Peter, could you not wait with me for 1 hour? Watch." He's going to come back again, and what's he going to find? Peter's going to be asleep. And again, he's going to rouse him from his sleep and say, "Peter, pray with me. Be watchful. Be alert." And when he comes back the 3rd time, what does he find? Peter's asleep. And note that these aren't even the 3 betrayals that Jesus is talking about. This isn't even the 3 denials that Jesus is talking about. Those will come later, and we're going to talk about those next week. But what we see here is that when sin comes into our lives, it never comes in the form that we're thinking. I read a book whenever I was in seminary, and it was a lot of stories about different pastors who had fallen morally in different ways. Some of them had become embezzlers and had stolen from the church. Some of them had fallen into adultery and sexual misconduct with congregants and others. And in all of these stories, not a single one of these guys said, "Yeah, I just woke up one day and I was like, you know what? I could probably take some money from the church. You know what? I could probably steal. You know what? I could probably ruin my marriage of 30 years and my reputation in the community and the love that my children have for me by having an affair with this secretary." None of them said that. In fact, I guarantee you that if you would have told them, "You're going to steal millions of dollars from the church," they would have said, "No, not I." They would have been emphatic about it. Everybody else might do something like that. Maybe every other pastor in America, but not me. Right? "You're going to cheat on your spouse. You're going to do this." No. Every other husband might do that, but definitely not me. You see, the insidiousness of sin is that it convinces us that, no, we would never do anything like that, right? No, we dabble in just the little sins. And here we see the progression in Peter's own life of saying, "Jesus, I would never betray you. Jesus, I would die with you." But he won't even stay awake for an hour with Jesus. And we see it going from these small betrayals to full-blown denials in this same chapter. And the same is true in our lives. That we might think, "No, I would never do these crazy sins out there. I would never betray my relationship. I would never hurt somebody like that. I would never turn away from the Lord. I would never do any of these different things that I see going on." Never, not me, no. But you see, the insidiousness of sin is that it never comes at you all at once. It's little by little by little. And again, in that book where it went through the kind of progression that all of these pastors went through, one of them specifically was that he had forgotten a receipt. He didn't know where the receipt was, and it was always a hassle to deal with the financial secretary whenever you forgot a receipt. They're like, "Where's this receipt? Where's it at?" You're like, "I don't know. It's lost. It's gone," right? And then they get frustrated, and they have to call the place, and they have to get it duplicated, and it's this whole thing. So he's just like, "I don't want to have to deal with that." So he just made a receipt on his computer. Just made it and was like, "That's fine. Like, I know I spent this much. I know it was for this thing." So he just kind of made up the receipt on his computer and submitted it and was like, "Cool. I'm going to not have to deal with all of that mess," right? He really spent the money on that thing. It's not that big of a deal. But then a few months later, the same thing happened, and he didn't even think about it. He just made the receipt because now he knew he could do it, right? And it wasn't that big of a deal, and so he could just make the receipt. So then he makes the receipt, and he does this several times. Pretty much now, anytime that he loses a receipt, he's just making a new one because, again, he doesn't want to incur the wrath of the financial secretary. So he's just kind of going through these things until one day he's a little short on funds, and then he remembers that he can make a receipt. So he's like, oh, it's not, it's $50 in a tank of gas, right? And I can just say that was a ministry expense. And so he makes a receipt. And by the end of it, he ended up embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the church. And again, if you would have asked him, would you ever steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from the church? He would tell you, just as Peter said emphatically, no. I would never do something so heinous. I would never do something to betray my people. I would never do something like that. But little by little, one piece by one piece, sin snuck in and took a hold of his heart, and all of a sudden those things that were unthinkable became commonplace. And that's the truth of sin in our own life, is that whenever we don't deal with the little sins that come in, whenever we don't deal with those things that we think are kind of insignificant and not really that big of a deal, whenever we don't address those things and turn them over to the Lord, then pretty soon those things which were unthinkable become commonplace. In the book of Song of Solomon, chapter number 2, the bride, in speaking to Solomon, says, "My love, catch the little foxes that would come in and spoil the vine." See, in their relationship, she knew it wasn't going to be these big giant things. It was going to be these little tiny things that were going to sneak in. They could sneak past the defenses, because foxes are really cute animals, guys. Like, if you see a fox, you're like, oh, it's so cute, right? But if you have a chicken coop, a fox is a lot less cute. And it's kind of the same thing in our life. Oh, it's just this little sin. It's just this little thing. It's not that big of a deal. Nobody's ever going to know that I'm doing this thing. It's not like a big sin. It's not one of those giant sins. It's not like those sins that those other people are doing. It's just this little sin. But the problem is that those little sins are the ones that come away and they eat at the roots of the fruit that is growing in our lives. And oftentimes it is those little sins that transform into the big sins. And again, those things that were unthinkable can become commonplace in our lives if we don't take care of the little sins that would seek to come in and spoil the vine. And we see that here with Peter. Never, Lord. And it's interesting because the way this sentence is constructed, where Peter says this, he said emphatically, and then this word isn't included here because of the way that the sentence is structured. He says, "Yet if I must die with you." And that word "yet" is the same word that we're about to see from Jesus. Nevertheless, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. See, the nevertheless of Peter was predicated upon his own strength. Was predicated upon what he thought he was capable of, what he thought that he would do, what he thought that he would never do. The nevertheless of Jesus was predicated upon full surrender and submission to God. So as we continue to read here, this is what we see. In verse number 32, "And they went to a place called Gethsemane." Again, they went to the place of pressing, the place of being pressed. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. Again, let me read those words. Jesus, the Son of God, became greatly distressed and troubled. Again, something that I just want to mention from that really struck me this week, as I said, even if Jesus, the perfect, holy Son of God in his life, sometimes, because of the great weight of the sin of this world, because of the plan that was laid out before him, because of the path that God had called him to walk on, if even he at different times became greatly distressed and troubled, my friends, sometimes we're going to become greatly distressed and troubled too. Sometimes the weight of this world, sometimes the things that go on in our lives will cause us to be greatly distressed and troubled. But something that we know about Christ is that he never sinned. See, sometimes we think if we're distressed or if we're troubled, then we're living in sin. We're like, oh, I should just have more faith. If I just had more faith, everything would be fine, right? But we know that that's not something you can just manufacture or turn up, right? It's not just like, yes, I'd like a 50% more faith, please, Holy Spirit. Thank you. Great. And then now you can just move into that thing. That's not the way it works. Sometimes in this life, there are troubles, there are worries, there are things that will cause us to be distressed, that will cause us in the very deepest parts of our soul to have trouble. And even in those things, we know that we can relate with Christ. Even in those things, Christ, our great high priest, Christ who took on flesh, he understands us in our trouble. He understands us when this weight of the world is crushing. As he was in this place of pressing, he understands when we ourselves go through times of pressing. Whenever we feel distressed, whenever we don't see a way out, whenever things feel just too hard. Can I remind you that Christ is with you? Christ understands your feeling. And even in that, do as he did and turn to God. So we see this now in verse number 34. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even unto death. Remain here and watch. So again, this picture, Jesus has just told all of his disciples, all of you will fall away. Peter's like, not me. Now, Jesus leaves the other disciples, and he takes Peter and James and John, and he goes further into the garden. And he's telling them, for the first time that we ever read in Scripture, that my heart is sorrowful, even unto death, that I am vexed, that I am feeling the full weight of the sin of this world about to be placed upon me. Jesus expresses his sorrow to his disciples in real and raw terms. He says, guys, I've told you over and over again that I'm about to die, and I feel the full weight of that death and that torture and that rejection coming on me even now. And what does he say? He said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even unto death. Remain here and watch. Again, that word watch isn't like, hey, make sure that nobody comes to get me. Jesus knows, right? Jesus knows that Judas is going to come with the captain of the guard. Jesus isn't like, give me a few more minutes and keep a lookout, guys, and warn me if somebody's coming to take me. No, whenever he's telling them to watch, he's saying, pray with me. Pray for me. Pray for yourselves. Be awake. Remember at the end of Mark chapter 13, reading through all of the horrors and the things that Jesus said would come in the future, all of these things that would happen at both the destruction of Jerusalem and the future date. As he's talking about these things, what does he tell his disciples? Be awake. Be awake. Watch. Be watchful, lest you fall into sin, lest it comes upon you unaware. Be watchful of what is happening. And Jesus now is telling them the same thing. Watch. Be awake, be alert. These things that I've told you that you will fall away from me, would you pray? Would you pray for me? Would you just give me this support even as I am here? And we're about to see that weight fully coming on to Christ. He says, as I'm here and I am burdened and I'm hurting, will you watch with me? Will you pray with me? Will you support me? And this is what we read now is Jesus' prayer again. One of the most famous portions of Scripture, and it is so, so good. And going a little further, he fell down onto the ground. Even that picture there of Jesus just feeling in a physical way the spiritual burden that's being placed upon him. And as he's walking, he gets very little ways from the disciples before he just collapses on the ground. And as he falls down, we see his prayer. If it were possible that this hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. It's such a famous passage of Scripture because it's so powerful, right? Because the hardest thing for us to overcome in this life is our own desires, right? Is our own wills. That's what really trips us up is like, yeah, we know what Jesus wants for us. Like we have the Bible. Most of us have read the Bible. We know what he wants. We know what sin is. And yet, why don't we do it? Because we want other stuff, right? Even just in regular things in life, right? Like why aren't we all just super jacked and good looking? Well, because we want pizza and tacos like every day of the week, right? Like that's just true. We want other things, and so that distracts us from the things that we're doing. And that's just the way that it goes. Like whenever God is telling us to do something, what keeps us from doing that thing? It's not this world is so strong. It's not that the devil is so evil. No, it's our own desires. It's the thing that we want. It's the fact that whenever God says, love your enemy, we're like, yeah, but no. Because I'd really rather just make fun of them behind their back and say how much I really don't like that person and really just completely avoid them instead of loving them. That's way too hard. So how about avoid thy enemies? Can I get that one, Lord? Right? The things in life that keep us from following often the will of God is not all of the external things. It's the internal things. It's not all of the powers of evil and all of the forces of nature in the world. It's our own will. It's our own sinful nature that often keeps us from following the way of the Lord. But Jesus, in this time, he said, Lord, all things are possible for you. Would you remove this cup from me? But even now, even feeling this weight of sin, even knowing what lays ahead of me, and nothing in this flesh says it wants to do that, right? Nothing in this flesh says, I want to be whipped and beaten. I want to be crucified and spat on. I want to be mocked and despised. No part of me wants to do that. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And right after he prays this amazing prayer, he goes, and we see in verse number 37, and he came and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch for 1 hour? And again, I know we don't have the exact inflection of how Jesus spoke this, but I don't think that Jesus was like, Simon, could you not watch for 1 hour? Oh, like he wasn't Napoleon Dynamite in that thing, right? Like he wasn't just like, oh gosh, can't even watch for an hour. Like, but whenever Jesus says this, he's like, Simon, couldn't even watch for 1 hour. For 1 hour, you couldn't watch with me. I just see this weight of just disappointment and love and hopefulness. Again, Jesus had told Peter in one of the synoptics specifically, he said, Satan has desired to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. Jesus even was praying for Peter, knowing that he would betray him, knowing that he would leave him. And Jesus comes to him and he says, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch for 1 hour? And then he says to him again, watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. Indeed, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, doesn't this just speak to the nature of how sin comes into our lives? The zeal that the disciples had in their exclamation that no, they would never fall away from the Lord, that they would never betray him, that they would never turn from him. Absolutely. Nevertheless, under no circumstances would they ever turn from Christ. And yet again, the words of Jesus came true. All of them would fall away. All of them would be scattered. So here, whenever he tells them this simple phrase, that your spirit is willing, the part of you that wants to say, I would never do something like that. I would never betray the Lord like that. I would never betray my spouse like that. I would never betray the church like that. I would never betray my job like that. I would never betray my friends like that. Those parts of you that say that, that's the spirit. It's willing. It wants to do that. It wants that to be true so badly, but your flesh is weak. Your flesh is weak. And if you let your flesh do what it wants to do, then all of those things that your spirit wants to, all of those great aspirations and those things that you say, may they never be true, mean nothing when you let your flesh rule your life. Which is why it's so important for us to take care, again, of those little sins. the little sins that come into our lives, the little foxes that seek to come in and spoil the fruit of the vine in our lives. If we don't take care of them, we start to see that shift from our spirit being willing and our flesh wanting to do that thing. And we feed our flesh little by little with those little sins and say, yeah, I would never do that, but I'll do this little thing. I would never do that, but I'll do this little thing. And where our flesh was dominated by our spirit whenever we are obedient to the Word of God, now our spirit becomes dominated by our flesh whenever we feed it constantly with those things which the Lord has told us will destroy us. We have to be so careful. Even Jesus tells his disciples, your spirit is willing. Your desire that you're saying that you would never fall away, it's good. And your spirit wants to do that, but your flesh is weak. You have to realize that. And so he's telling them, watch and pray. So now we come to verse number 39. And again, he went away and prayed, saying the same words. I want to stop here again for a second, just because sometimes whenever we're praying, do you ever feel like you run out of words? Do you ever feel like, God, I've already told you everything that I could possibly tell you. I've already poured out my heart to you. What is there even left to say? And you kind of feel weird about just praying the same thing over and over again. You kind of feel weird about like, well, God, you already know. Like, should I even say these things? Like, I've already told you everything. But here we see that Jesus didn't go and he didn't feel like he had to come up with some new novel prayer and pray in some different way. But what did he do? He just continued to pour out his heart to the Father. And if you ever get to that point in your life, and maybe you're at that point in your life right now where you feel like you're praying the same prayers every single day, every single week, and you're like, God, you've heard this before. Hey, God, me again, right? Like, and you're just saying the same things over and over again, and you're just like, why do I even pray? Why should I even continue to do this? God already knows. Yes, he knows, but yes, it's okay to continue to pour out your heart. Jesus, in his time of vexation, didn't go and say, well, God, everything that I said last time, you already know, so I guess I'm just going to sit here and not speak to you. No, his relationship with the Father was such where even if he didn't have anything new to say from the 5 minutes from when he went here to when he went to check on his disciples, he continued to pour out his heart. I think that's okay for us too. Sometimes we feel like we've run out of words, like we've said everything that we needed to say, like we don't even know what else we could possibly say, and so why bring it up to the Father again? But Jesus, who knew the Father better than anyone because he was one with the Father, never felt strange about going back to the Father and even saying the same thing as he said before. So let's never grow weary in praying, even if it's the same words, even if we're like, Lord, the situation doesn't seem like it's changing. It seems like I've already told you all of these things. There's something in that practice of bringing even the same hurts, even the same disappointments, even the same fears over and over again and laying them at the feet of the Father. Even if we don't have new words, even if we don't have a novel way to say it, even if we feel like we've already said everything there is to say, we can still bring those things and lay them at the feet of the Father over and over again, as many times as it takes, and every time he hears us. And we see Jesus do that he said the same words. And again, he came and he found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And again, before we get too rough on the disciples here, let me just ask this question. How many of you guys think the best nap of the year is the one after Thanksgiving dinner? Right? You know when you're just full, you have all the turkey and all the ham and all the mashed potatoes and all the stuffing and 17 different varieties of pie. Like you've eaten everything, and then you're wearing your stretchy pants, you go and you just kind of sit down on the couch, and almost involuntarily you kind of drift away into sleep, right? And it's a good nap. That's kind of the position that the disciples are in here. Remember that the Passover was the greatest feast in the calendar of the Hebrew people. They would go and they would eat and they would celebrate. Remember, it's basically a 15-course whole meal thing that they go through. And so there's 15 different movements that happen during this course of the meal. And so they have bread, and then they have more bread, and then they have food, and then they have lamb, and then they have the bitter lamb sauce that goes with the lamb. And so, just like they're so full of all of this food. And then they go and they're sitting in a dark garden, right? And Jesus walks away, and they're sitting there. They want to pray, The best way to pray is to close your eyes, right? So you just kind of close your eyes a little bit. And before you know it, it's that nap after Thanksgiving. So before we're too hard on the disciples, like, wow, they couldn't even stay awake. I mean, they did just have that big Thanksgiving meal. And again, before we're too hard on the disciples, remember that the reason that these stories are told is because, yes, they actually happened, and we're the same people. We do the same things. And so as much as we're like, man, that's the Peteriest Peter thing that's ever been Petered, sometimes I'm like, wow, that's the most Calebiest Caleb thing that's ever been Caleb, because I do the same things over and over again and repeat those patterns in my own life, right? And you probably have the same thing in your life where you do the same things over and over again. So again, as we look at the disciples here, it's not just, hey, this is what Peter and James and John did, but this is what we're all susceptible to. And Jesus came to them and he said, watch and pray. Jesus goes back and he finds them sleeping, and this is definitely relatable. They didn't know how to answer him, right? Did you ever get caught doing something from your parents, like you need to go to sleep or you need to not do this, and then you're like, okay, and then they come back and they catch you doing the same thing again, and you have like no excuse, right? You're just like, I can't say that I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to do that because you told me 3 minutes ago that I wasn't supposed to do that. I can't say that I forgot because it literally happened 3 minutes ago. But so you're just like, I don't even know what to answer. And that's how the disciples felt. Jesus had just told them, watch and pray, stay awake. And he comes back, they've done the exact same thing. Relatable? It's relatable. And so then we continue now. And he came a third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise. Let us be going. My betrayer is at hand. 3 times. Peter, I would never betray you, Lord. Though I have to die with you, I will never leave you. Called into a place of intimacy with the Lord and asked to pray, asked to watch. What does Peter do? He falls asleep. 3 different times. A reflection of the 3 different denials that he would have with Christ. He falls asleep 3 times, and soon he would deny 3 times. But again, falling asleep isn't that bad. We can understand it. They just had the Passover. They're full. It's late at night. They're out in this garden. There's probably a nice cool breeze blowing through. It's kind of the perfect condition to take a little nap. That's why we have to be so careful about the things that we allow to come into our lives, about how viciously and vigorously we kill the sin that comes into our lives. It was the great Puritan pastor, John Owen, who said, be killing sin or it will be killing you. And I think there's truth to that. These little things, these little foxes that come into our lives and convince us that they're not so bad. They're actually kind of cute. It's fine. If they're not addressed, can often lead to bigger and bigger issues. I also think it's interesting that specifically we're about to read here, right? Be awake, be alert, be watching. Peter obviously didn't think that that was a super important command. Because again, he fell asleep and fell asleep and fell asleep. But Peter is ready for action in a specific way, and we're about to see that. He says, my betrayer is at hand. And then verse number 43, immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12. Again, Mark just adds that in there. Judas, one of the 12 closest people to Jesus came. Not some other Judas, not some random Judas. You know, it's kind of like the name John, like, we've got John. We've got many Johns. You can know many Johns. And if I say, I saw John the other day, well, which John? There's a lot of Johns. No, there's no denying who this was. This was Judas, one of the 12. Judas Iscariot, the one who should have seen Jesus, who should have known Jesus, who should have loved Jesus. And a crowd with him with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Again, I think it's worth mentioning again, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, that it is the people who are rejecting Jesus. These people are the ones who should have got it. Who do we see here? One of his closest disciples. One of the 12 people who walked, who ate bread from his hand, from the fish and the loaves, who saw him calm the storm, is there. Who else is there? The chief priests, the one who are supposed to administer the sacrifices in the temple, the ones who have waited their entire life, who have been brought up in priestly homes, hearing about the Torah and the law of Moses and all of the things that Moses said and all of the prophecies about the Messiah. And who else? We see the scribes, the ones who had literally written down with their own hands all of the commands and all of the words of the Old Testament. They had written them down in long form over and over again, and they should have seen that Christ was the Messiah, and they didn't. And the elders, the ones who were the leaders of the nation, the ones who were supposed to point them to holiness, point them to the way of God. No, it was his very own disciple and the chief priests and the scribes and the elders, the ones who should have seen Christ, who now came seeking his life. So now we see that they came with the chief priests and the scribes and the elders, and now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. And again, we talked about this before whenever we talked about just the betrayal of Judas, but just the intimacy. And again, Jesus wasn't fooled. Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him. Jesus knew that this man had sold him out to the chief priests and the scribes. Jesus, even just here 2 verses before, said, "Hey, let's get up so that we can go meet my betrayer." Right? He knew that they were coming for him. And yet, he still let Judas get close. He still let Judas get close enough to him to kiss him. That's an extravagant kind of love and compassion and acceptance on a specific level that I can't understand. If I knew somebody was coming to stab me in the back, I'm walking backwards, right? I'm like, "Where are you at?" I'm looking. I'm ready. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to let this person betray me. And yet Jesus, knowing that it was one of his closest disciples, one of the people who had followed him, knowing that he was going to come, still allowed him to betray him with a kiss. And all of this just showing Christ's submission to the Father's plan. Again, we see that prophecy that he would be betrayed with a kiss. We knew that this was something that was going to happen. Jesus himself knew that this was something that had to happen according to the providential will of the Father. And instead of bucking against it, instead of saying, "No, Lord, that's too far." Like, sure, I have to go to the cross. Sure, I will become sin that they might become the righteousness of God. But to let Judas get close enough to me to kiss me? No. Like, save me that scorn. Save me that embarrassment. Save me that betrayal. But Jesus didn't. He submitted fully to it. And it says, and he came and he went up at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and they seized him. But the one who stood by drew his sword and struck the ear of the servant of the high priest and cut it off. So again, we know here from the Gospels that it was Peter who drew his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest. And again, it's interesting that all of the things that Jesus told him to be watchful of, to be ready for, watch and pray, stay awake and pray, he wouldn't do. But as soon as the ear cutting time came, he was ready. And often, we can be the same way too. All of those other commands that we just are like, "Oh man, those things are hard to follow, those things are hard to follow, those things are hard to follow." But as soon as the time of action comes, we assume that we're going to be ready. We assume that, well, I am a Christian and I kind of have a relationship with God, and so I don't need to be steeped in his word and in his commands to be able to be ready when that time of action comes. And that's kind of what Peter thought. I don't need to have watched with Christ whenever he called me, but as soon as somebody needs their ear cut off, like, I'll be ready. I'll be the one to do it. But even in that, Peter acted out of line, because what do we see Jesus do? Struck the ear of the servant of the high priest, and Jesus said to them, have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple and teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scripture be fulfilled. And they all left him and fled. The saying, I split two, but they all left him and fled. So again, here we now see, and again, the partner passage to this, we see that after Peter cuts off Malchus's ear, Jesus picks it up, puts it back on, and he heals his ear. Peter was zealous for something that the Lord wasn't zealous for. That's what happens whenever we're not focused on the things that the Lord tells us to be focused on. But instead of being zealous for the things that the Lord is zealous for, we become zealous for our own things, and we miss it. So Peter cuts off this man's ear. He doesn't stay awake and watch with the Lord. He's not obeying the commands that the Lord has given him to command. But as soon as something comes that he's zealous about, protect Jesus, and cuts off his ear. But then what happens immediately after that? And they all left him and fled. Whenever I was reading this, I was just thinking about just the mercy and the compassion of God. Doesn't that just show through in these scriptures? Makes me think of the book of 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse number 13, where he says, even when we are faithless, he remains faithful because he cannot deny himself. God is a God of faithfulness, and even in the verses that we've memorized here this year specifically, it talks about the faithfulness and the compassion of God. Last year specifically, we said, as a father has compassion on his children, so he has compassion on us, knowing that we are dust. God understands our frailties. He understands our idiosyncrasies. He understands the ways that we have difficulty following his commands, and even in those things, he has such grace and mercy and compassion on us. And again, with his disciples, and he knew that they would all flee. He knew that they would all run away, and yet he still invited them. He still told them, watch and pray. He still brought them close with him. And that's the amazing truth about Christ. That as we're followers of Christ, and as we often reflect the same way of the disciples, that we miss the point, that we think, those things I would never do, I would never ever do them, and then somehow we end up doing those. That as we fumble and stumble through this world that we live in, God is gracious. God is so gracious to us. And so we balance those two stories that we now see. The disciples constantly with their loud voices. I would never betray you, Lord. Never, Peter. All those other people might betray you, but never me. And then we see Jesus with grace and mercy and truth. No, you will, but I'll be waiting when you do. No, you will, but I'm ready to restore you. No, you will, but I love you. Isn't that the truth of Christ in our own lives? That even as followers, even as those who have been purchased by his blood, who have been bought by his blood, who love him, who have accepted him, who are indwelt by the Holy Spirit, sometimes we're just a bunch of knuckleheads. Sometimes we just don't get it. Sometimes we still mess up. Sometimes day after day, we just keep stumbling into the same things. And yet Christ reminds us that he's waiting for us. Yet Christ continually gives us his command and saying, this is the way to life, come and walk in it. He continually says that even whenever we stumble and we fall and we are scattered, he's waiting for us. And those aren't two different stories. Those are the same story. So if you're with us here today, and there are just things that you just continually stumble and fall and struggle with and fight against, don't give up. Don't give up fighting against those things. God has told us that we are supposed to kill our sin, that those things that displease him and those things that bring death into our life and those little foxes that sneak in and seek to destroy the vineyards, that we are supposed to, with extreme prejudice, eliminate those things from our lives. But when we mess up, when we fall, when we fumble the perfect opportunity for the touchdown, and we feel that in the deepest ways, let us never forget that Christ is merciful and compassionate and kind, and he waits for us to return to him. And that should drive us not to apathy of saying, well, I guess I don't have to deal with my sin, but instead it should drive us to a love that says, Lord, any grievous way that is in me, remove it far from me. So wherever you stand today, maybe you feel like you're doing pretty good. Maybe you feel like in this battle with the flesh and with sin and with the world that we're constantly fighting against, that you're at a high flow and everything is going pretty good. Can I remind you to lean on the Lord? Can I remind you that he's your only strength and your only source of salvation? Maybe you're at a low ebb. It's the third time that Christ has found you asleep whenever he asked you to pray. And you just feel like you keep on falling into the same things over and over and over again. And you're praying the same prayers over and over and over again. And you're fighting the same battles over and over and over again. Can I remind you that even when we are faithless, God remains faithful? That even whenever we stumble, Christ waits to catch us. That even whenever we abandon him, he says, I'll be waiting at home for you guys. And that's the beauty of the gospel. And so as we live our lives, would we be people who are constantly, vigorously, and intentionally killing the sin that's in our lives, seeking to please God, seeking to live the life that is truly life by obeying his commands. And at the same time, know that whenever we fall, because we will, and whenever we stumble, because we will, and whenever 3 times in a row we mess it up, because we will, that the Lord waits with grace and compassion and faithfulness. Would you pray with me?